laughing clown. The carnival had always been strange, but there was something different about it now. Calvin, a seasoned carnival worker, had spent years traveling from town to town, setting up games, stalls, and tents. He was no stranger to the odd, the unsettling, or the downright creepy aspects of carnival life. But what he experienced this summer was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. It started, as all horrors do, quietly. Late one night, after the last customer had left, Calvin was making his usual rounds, locking up and making sure everything was secure for the night. The carnival grounds, so full of life and noise during the day, became unnervingly silent after closing. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the Ferris wheel in the wind and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. But that night, as Calvin made his way past the rows of tents, he heard something new. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a soft, high-pitched giggle. He stopped in his tracks, scanning the darkened carnival. The giggle came again, slightly louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the grounds, near the long-abandoned clown tent. The clown tent had been shut down for years. No one went near it, and it had become a kind of legend among the workers. Some said it was cursed, others claimed that something terrible had happened there long ago, though no one knew the details. Calvin had never paid much attention to the stories. To him, it was just another empty, forgotten tent. But as he stood there, listening to that eerie giggle, something in his gut told him to stay away. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination, and quickly finished his rounds. The next night, the giggling returned. Only this time it was louder. And it wasn't just giggling anymore. It was laughter, hearty, maniacal laughter, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Calvin froze again as he passed the clown tent. The laughter seemed to be coming from inside, echoing off the canvas walls. It was impossible. The tent had been empty for years. Probably just a trick of the wind, Calvin muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. He hurried back to the trailer where the other workers were already asleep. But the laughter didn't stop. Every night it grew louder, more persistent, and each night it seemed to start earlier. By the end of the week, Calvin could hear it before the carnival even closed. He asked the other workers if they heard it too, but they all looked at him like he was crazy. No one else heard anything. Then came the night Calvin decided to investigate. The carnival had just closed for the night, and the grounds were still and silent. Calvin, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, made his way toward the old clown tent. The laughter was louder than ever, practically vibrating through the air. His hands shook as he reached for the flap of the tent. It felt like the air itself was pushing back against him, as if the tent didn't want him to enter. With a deep breath, Calvin stepped inside. The tent was musty and dark. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. The laughter was all around him now, bouncing off the walls of the tent, but there was no one inside. The laughter seemed to have no source, like it was coming from the very walls of the tent itself. Calvin's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. Old, rotting costumes lay scattered across the floor, and in the corner, a cracked mirror reflected his pale face back at him. But there was something else in the reflection, something that made his blood run cold. Behind him, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure, a clown. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Calvin could make out the outline of its tall, lanky frame and the frilly ruffles of its decayed costume. He spun around, but the figure was gone. The laughter stopped. Calvin stood there, frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt something beneath his feet and looked down. There, half buried under an old pile of costumes, was a dusty old book, a diary. Calvin picked it up, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was clear. The diary belonged to someone named Felix, a clown who had worked at the carnival decades ago. The entries started off normal descriptions of daily performances, interactions with other workers, but as Calvin flipped through the pages, the tone of the writing grew darker, more erratic. Felix wrote of strange rituals performed in secret, rituals that supposedly granted him eternal life in exchange for unspeakable acts. He wrote about how he had lured unsuspecting carnival goers into the tent, never to be seen again. The final entry was nothing but a single, scrawled sentence: "The laughter never stops." Calvin dropped the diary and stumbled out of the tent, his mind reeling. He tried to convince himself it was all just an elaborate prank, but deep down, he knew the truth. Felix was still here, and the laughter would never stop. The next day, Calvin tried to shake the events of the previous night from his mind, but the laughter continued, growing louder with each passing hour. Worse, he started to see the clown just out of the corner of his eye, always disappearing before he could get a good look. He wasn't the only one noticing strange things either. Other workers had started to go missing. First, it was Greg, the guy who ran the Ferris wheel. He didn't show up for work one morning, and no one could find him. Then it was Maggie, who worked the games booth. Her trailer was found empty, with no sign of a struggle. Calvin tried to warn the others, to tell them what he had seen, but no one believed him. They all thought he was losing it. Desperate, Calvin returned to the tent, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. The tent was as empty as before, but this time there was something new. In the center of the room stood an old clown costume, propped up on a mannequin. It hadn't been there before. Calvin cautiously approached it, his flashlight beam trembling. The costume was filthy and torn, but what drew Calvin's attention was the face, the clown mask. It was grotesque, with exaggerated features and a permanent, twisted smile. The eyes were hollow, staring back at him like black voids. As he reached out to touch it, the laughter returned, louder than ever, echoing through the tent like a chorus of voices. Suddenly, the mask twitched. Calvin yanked his hand back in horror as the mannequin began to move, its joints creaking like old wood. The clown turned its head toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. Calvin stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering in the darkness. "Come play with me," the clown rasped, its voice a twisted mockery of a human laugh. Calvin bolted out of the tent, his heart racing. He ran through the carnival, past the rides and booths, not stopping until he reached his trailer. He locked the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tried to calm himself, to convince himself it wasn't real, but the sound of laughter still echoed in his ears. That night, as he lay in bed, the laughter grew closer. He heard footsteps outside his trailer, slow and deliberate. He pulled the blankets over his head, trembling, but the footsteps stopped just outside his door. The handle rattled, and then the laughter right outside his window. Calvin didn't sleep that night. He knew it was only a matter of time before the clown came for him. The next morning, Calvin decided to leave. He couldn't stay here anymore, not with the disappearances, the laughter, and the visions of that grotesque clown. But as he packed his things, he noticed something odd. His reflection in the mirror, it wasn't right. His face looked distorted, twisted into a hideous grin. His eyes were wide and vacant, just like the clown's. He blinked, and the vision was gone, but the laughter remained. Calvin left the carnival that day, but no one ever saw him again. Some say he became the latest victim of the laughing clown, cursed to wander the grounds, luring others into the tent. Others claim they still hear his voice on quiet nights, calling out for help, drowned out by the sound of endless laughter. And if you ever find yourself at that carnival, late at night, you might just hear it too. The faint, maniacal laughter of the clown, echoing through the empty tents, searching for its next victim. The laughter never stops.